Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, Iterative Pragmatic Approaches to Guiding and Evaluating Adaptations in Real-World Settings with Implications to Research within the EHE Initiative. I'm Jasmine, and so some of you may not know me, but I am new to the ISKI team, and I am the Research Study Coordinator Senior on the ISKI project. We are very excited for this webinar today and just want to remind everybody that since this is different from the Zoom meetings, this is a Zoom webinar. And just a reminder that if you do have questions, you will use the Q&A function throughout the webinar so that we can go ahead and answer these questions for you. So I'm just going to start with some bios. So Dr. Glasgow, along with Dr. Rabin, is presenting today. And so Dr. Glasgow is the director of the Dissemination and Implementation Science program of the Accords and research professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. From 2010 to 2014, he was deputy director for implementation science in the Division of Cancer Control and Population Science at the U.S. National Cancer Institute. Dr. Glasgow is one of the original developers of the REAIM, PRISM, and dynamic sustainability frameworks. He is an implementation scientist whose work focuses on public health issues of enhancing the reach and adoption of evidence-based programs, adaptation and context, and pragmatic research methods and measures to enhance health equity and sustainment. Dr. Glasgow has published over 500 articles, been the PI on 25 NIHN or HRQ grants, and is among the top 1% of the most frequently cited social scientists. He currently focuses much of his time on mentoring, training, and building the capacity in implementation science. So Dr. Glasgow, thank you for being here. And Dr. Rabin is an assistant professor at the UC San Diego Herbert Werdum School of Public Health and Human Longevity Science, the co-director of the U.S. San Diego Dissemination and Implementation Science Center, DISC, and the San Diego CFAR Implementation Science Hub, an implementation science expert on a number of large NIH and VA Center grants and research projects, including the VA San Diego Center of Excellence for Stress and Mental Health and Quadruple Aim Query Program in Denver, VA. Dr. Rabin's research focuses on improving population health outcomes in real-world clinical and public health settings through increasing the equitable research, adoption, implementation, and sustained use of evidence-based interventions. She does this through the development of models, methods, and measures for dissemination and implementation science and their application across diverse topic areas, populations, and settings in order to demonstrate the wide utility and broad generalizability. Dr. Rabin also has extensive expertise in developing and implementing novel and diverse capacity building approaches for dissemination and implementation research. So thank you, Dr. Rabin and Dr. Glasgow, and I hand it off to you. So thank you.
Jasmine, thank you so much, and Brennan for the warm welcome. I will share my screen and I will be advancing slides for us this morning. Let me see if I can make this into presentation mode. Super. And just wanted to thank everyone for being here and allowing us to talk about adaptations and specifically the iterative REAIM, which is a methodology that we have been working on over the past couple of years, trying to advance the field, and hopefully at some point we will figure this out. But at this point, we wanted to share with you what we have learned so far. We provided our affiliations and availability here, so you can email us after the presentation as well. And then you can also visit our websites where we have additional resources provided. I did want to acknowledge that the work that we will be presenting today was inspired and informed by many colleagues. Most recently, I had the good fortune to co-present with Anna Baumann, Shannon Wilson-Sturman, and Christopher Miller as part of the adaptation workshop at the DNI conference. So if you attended, you can access that. And there is more detailed information about the background information that we cannot cover today. We also have a number of wonderful colleagues, both in Denver and San Diego and around the country, who have been contributing this work. And so we listed some of them there, and then we have some funding acknowledgements as well. So today what we will try to do, we have limited time and we are not going to be able to give you a full preview of what adaptations are about. But what we will try to do is just introduce some basic terms, talk a little bit about how planning for adaptation can be guided by frameworks. What does it mean to document adaptations, and share with you one example. And then Russ will take over from me to talk about a pragmatic iterative re-aim process and share with you our learnings to date. And then we will close with some general discussion, but hopefully some comments from you and questions from you that we can kind of guide that by. We will have a few polls throughout this presentation, and then we will also have an opportunity in the middle to stop and answer some of the questions. And I don't see your questions right now as I am presenting, so I will be relying on that little break to look at those. So the first thing we will do is this mini polling of the audience, and I will ask Brennan to put this up. The first question we will ask you is about your experience with adaptations in your current projects, and there are some options. My project has made planned adaptations. It has made unplanned adaptations. It has made both planned and unplanned adaptations. And we did not make any adaptations, but they are happening on the ground. And finally, we did not make any adaptations at all. So if you could choose the option that best describes your project, that would be wonderful. And then I don't know, Brennan, if I should read the second question, or are they going to come up separately?
They come up together.
Okay, super. So when we feel that it's a good time, I will read the second question as well. And that will be about your practices around documenting adaptations in your current projects. And the options there are, I am not documenting adaptations at this time. I am systematically and comprehensively documenting adaptations, kind of state-of-the-art approach. And I'm using some pragmatic documentation approaches as the third option. And then Brennan, when you see that there we have a good percent of results, if you don't mind to share those, that would be great.
About 63% of participants have voted at this point, so maybe another 30 seconds or so.
That sounds great. Wonderful. And so we can see here the results. For the first question, it looks like there is a nice variation with most of the projects, 52% respondents reported this, made both planned and unplanned adaptations. It looks like there was only one project or one person who reported no adaptations at all, and then others reported across the other options. And then for the second question, Brennan, I don't see the bottom of the answers. I only see the top two. So if you see all the answers, would you mind to read that out?
Sure. So 13 people, or 62%, reported pragmatically documenting adaptations.
Okay, wonderful. And then the other two was kind of evenly distributed with the other two categories. Thank you so much. So we will close this now and move on to the next slide. So we wanted to start with a definition of adaptations. Most commonly, they are referred to as changes or modifications to an intervention, an implementation strategy, or in some cases to the context. And while the original definition, or perhaps the most frequently used definition of adaptation, is intentional change, in some cases adaptations are also considered when they are non-intentional or accidental. The changes that we make to these interventions and implementation strategies or the context are almost always to improve our fit, the fit of the intervention with the local context, or the fit of the implementation strategy within the context where we try to implement. And we know that adaptations are very common. you have reported that most of the projects who you're working on have some form of adaptations, and often they are inevitable. They are needed to fit in a specific context. However, there are some concerns that if we are making dramatic adaptations, we can compromise the integrity of the intervention, and then that can result in lesser effectiveness. And so that's something that generates a great tension of, how much to change, when, to what. Next slide is me. And so historically, as we think about fidelity and adaptations, most of the work has been done in fidelity, and especially with more of the clinical randomized controlled trial context. Adaptations were not seen as desirable, and fidelity was hoped to be held up as a primary goal. However, as we think about more generalizability of our results, as we think about fidelity and adaptation, we talked about the tension, they both are needed for appropriate adaptation of evidence-based complex intervention in real-world settings. And so a more mature view of fidelity and adaptation now is that we have to somehow find that balance, and we need both of them as we are implementing in these complex interventions and contexts. And we have to work through what can be adapted when and for whom. So the idea is that adaptation is not good or bad, it just happens. And it's inherent in implementing complex interventions. In fact, we can talk about how interventions gain their effectiveness through the interaction of the intervention and the complex context in a bidirectional way. And if we are not looking at the opportunity for adaptations, we might be it might lead to a type 3 error of lack of implementation, which is perhaps one of the implementation failures might be one of the worst way that we can lose the effectiveness of our intervention. And so as we think about this, we can classify adaptations in different ways. This is kind of a simpler way that we have been thinking about classifying adaptations in our own work. You can see on the left side the 3 types of foci for adaptations: interventions, implementation strategy, and context. But then also we are thinking about when the adaptation happens. And most of the work to date has been happening in this planning and pre-implementation context, thinking about preparing evidence-based intervention for the new context. But the truth is there is a lot of adaptations that are happening during implementation and following implementation or during sustainment. And so we have to have that attention to those as well. So, the key recipe is that we have to balance fidelity and adaptation, but how to do that? So I'm going to talk about 3 potential strategies and the challenges of those. The first one is thinking about this notion that if we just knew what the core components are of the intervention, and we knew which are the flexible components, then we could make adaptations to the flexible components, keep the core components in place, and then we would be good. The second one is that if we do planning and it's a data-based process, adaptations are truly intentional, then we might be able to avoid some of the voltage drop or loss in effectiveness as a result of adaptations. And then finally, when we look at adaptations, often we don't assess them or document them systematically. So what can we do about that? So those are the 3 points I'm going to cover. And then Russ will present a case example of an innovative method to do this work. So thinking about complex interventions, first of all, I am sure that if I asked all of you, you would say that the intervention that you are working on in the context of the AHE initiative is a complex intervention. It is complex in many ways. The evidence-based interventions can take any of the forms that are presented here. I like these 7 Ps because it tells us that interventions can be truly not only traditional programs that we learned about in the public health training we got, but they can be practices, principles, procedures, products, pills, or policies. And so all of those carry different kinds of complexities. Generally, thinking about intervention complexity, there is just really great literature, and we provided here some citations if you want to read up on those a little bit more. But the notion that there are multiple interacting components, that there are challenging behaviors that we are addressing, and we are delivering these in real-world complex settings, that there are multiple levels, organizational or socio-ecological levels that we have to target. And we have to look at a number of outcomes, as well as there is a need for some flexibility and tailoring potential as we are putting these into place. And I'm thinking about the EHE project that we have been consulting on. All of those projects meet these criteria. And so this makes it a little bit tricky when we say that, oh, just select which are the core components or discretionary components of the intervention. It's a little bit harder to untangle it than in theory you would think, because these components interact with each other, they interact with the context and the implementation strategy. So the process of just identifying what can be changed and what cannot be is not straightforward. So we can do a number of different things to support this process. One of those is well supported by J.D. Smith's work through this initiative, creating an implementation research logic model. And this is just one example of work that Dr. Smith and Blumenthal in San Diego created for their project. So as you are working through a logic model, you are forced to think through some of these processes, mechanisms, and determinants that will define the success of your intervention. So this is a good logical starting point to identify some of the core components or functions of your intervention. There are some more advanced methodological approaches to optimize interventions and others that we will not cover today, but they can help you start to get into the details and understand the complexities of your work and how to untangle these two types of components. One that I will share is this paradigm around function and form. And I think I have seen that Dr. Monica Hoyes Perez was able to join us today. And she is the one who most recently have shown some applications to this paradigm in her work implementing patient-centered medical home in FQHCs. And so what she did, instead of trying to identify a very well-defined intervention in terms of what each FQHC need to do to implement patient-centered medical home, they worked on identifying core functions. And these core functions are basically processes and mechanisms that align with the principles of patient-centered medical home. And then these functions were what she felt we need to standardize or show fidelity to. What actually is being done at the site level, at the clinic level, that is left up to the site as long as it aligns with the core functions. So a very quick example, if the core function is to provide easier access to patients to care, then the different forms might be to extend hours when the clinics are operating, open up during the weekends, or provide telehealth. And all of those forms are defined by the clinics based on their strength and resources and preferences, and also the population they serve. So this is kind of the concept that we also applied here for a theoretical example for you in the context of HIV. Again, the idea of patient-centered care, which could be replaced by other type of motivating problems or principles. And then the core functions are the fostering relationship-based care, and then educating and supporting patients in learning to manage their own care. And then related forms are also identified here, how that could take shape in the context of an EHE project. So you can look at this and see whether this resonates with you. Of course, there are a number of questions regarding evaluation, how we compare interventions and others that have not been resolved when you use this paradigm. But I think that the concept of focusing on function is salient. Very briefly, thinking about planning for adaptation or adaptations prior to implementation. As I mentioned earlier, most of the work is done in this context. There are a number of models. Kem Escoffery and colleagues identified 13 different models that can guide pre-implementation adaptations. But the good news is that it almost doesn't matter which one you use, because when they looked at across the models, they identified 11 common steps that seems to be pretty consistently showing up in every single model. And so as long as you know these common steps, and you identified using either the common steps or one of these models is perfectly fine. And so as you can see, these are aligning along the lines of identifying community needs, identifying potential interventions that could align with those, selecting those interventions from a pool, consulting with the individuals who develop them so that you are becoming an expert in the intervention. And then based on that, you start to consult with diverse stakeholders to identify the mismatch in context between the original context and the current implementation context, identify which things will be adapted, and then make that adaptation systematic, potentially iterative. And then finally, they recommend that there is some form of evaluation of the new program. So that's kind of the general recipe for pre-implementation adaptations. The model that is most commonly used for this purpose in the HIV context is the Adapted model. And I'm sure many of you have used this before, and some of you are experts in using it. So this is the type of idea that we are thinking of. This paper by Wingwood and colleagues describe a number of good examples both in the US and in low and middle income countries, how to use Adapted. So I warmly recommend it. And then just a different option for you. This one, the IAM-ADAPT has a web-based support around it. So you might want to consider looking at this, developed by Maria Fernandez and colleagues. We also found this a useful way of thinking about pre-implementation adaptations. So when we look at pre-implementation adaptations, as Coffrey and colleagues also looked at what are the most frequent ones. And as you can see, cultural appropriateness is the number one, closely followed by focus on new target populations. So what we can kind of see that most work that is done is cultural adaptations, but there are other ideas where we need to consider the resources of the setting, the local policies, priorities. And so there are different reasons in addition to cultural adaptations that we might make changes to a program. So I'm going to move on to my last kind of theme here, the idea of documenting adaptations. So why would you do this? There are many reasons why I think it's important for us to start to think about this systematically. Knowing what gets changed in a program, both pre-implementation, but also during implementation. Understanding how to interpret our findings in the context of these adaptations. Considering refinements to the program, both during implementation and after. And then also starting to think about the impact of adaptations. This is an area that has not been explored fully. There are some models that are emerging, but being able to say that as a result of an adaptation, better or worse outcomes came about is critical, and I think we should start to develop that further. Of course, adaptation documentation is not easy. And there are at least a couple of types of challenges that I wanted to kind of highlight. One is the conceptual and historical one. As goes back to my perhaps second slide, that, historically in the context of clinical randomized controlled trial research, adaptations are not to be. They are not desirable, and they are often documented as procedure deviations. And so it takes a little bit of a paradigm shift to allow ourselves to think about this differently and allow ourselves to document them with a different kind of mindset, that these are welcomed and embraced. The other part of it, and I would just say that, this is often more problematic for the researcher than the community member, who is very comfortable with adaptations because that's what they live on a regular basis in their own work. So that's kind of what at least I have experienced. But giving permission to your partners and yourself to think about adaptations is a good starting point, we found. And then the other one is more methodological. And this is just for us to remember that I will show you a model in a moment that is a beautiful state-of-the-art comprehensive way of thinking of adaptations documentation, but it might be overwhelming. And so thinking about pragmatic ways, and recently we have been working with projects in our CFAR where they are asking simple questions from their team during regular meetings. For example, they say, did you have any challenge over the past month implementing the program? Did you have to make any changes as a result? And that's the extent to which they engage with adaptation documentation, but they do something. So don't let the perfect be the enemy of being done with the work. Some of us are geeky and we love to rely on this framework that was developed by Shannon Wiltsey-Sturman and colleagues, or some variation of it. Others might be just using a couple of questions to start to get to the idea of adaptations. So coming back to specific methodology here, and just a few more examples. Please remember, that these adaptations might happen to any of these components of intervention, implementation strategy, and context, and they might happen at different time points. In fact, we have this hypothesis, and we are starting to get some data that we expect to see different number and types of adaptations as we move through project implementation. And so, as the data will come in from different studies, we will be able to start to identify some types of adaptations that we can expect at different time points. The methods that you use is usually multi-method. We have not found, or I don't think anyone in the literature, any individual one method that would be perfect for this work and feasible. Obviously, observational techniques, going into the clinic and actually following the provider as they are delivering the intervention would be ideal, but often not possible. Sometimes you can do it with a small sample. Interviews, questionnaires, checklists, and logs. Some content analysis of meeting minutes or other type of documents can be helpful. And then sometimes we develop study databases, and sometimes you rely on the EMR to get this information. So I'm just showing you an example how we did this in a series of 5 projects within the Denver VA. 4 of them were associated with the Query program, and then 1 was an Office of Rural Health program. They were very diverse in terms of their topics and populations they served. And so what we standardized is the method of collecting data about adaptations. And we are just getting papers out of this final results, but the methods have been published. We used 4 methods. As you can see, there are some other ways that we could have done it, but we used 4 primary methods. And most of these were used in multiple studies, not all of them. Process maps, meeting notes, real-time database, and interviews were our key sources of data. And so we are now compiling, and there's one paper that is revised, resubmit, and one that we are going to submit soon, showing how these results come together to provide a full picture of adaptations. But this is just to say that any of these approaches would be appropriate. Generally, you will want to use multiple types of data sources and triangulate those. And then we provided here with the sample interview questions and the tracking sheet that we use, just kind of a flavor here. We can share these with you if you are interested. Please contact us. Some of these are already provided on websites. And then I will finish by saying that, we share here a few snippets, but there are many other colleagues who have been thinking about ways of capturing adaptations. So provided some additional literature, and we also have a slide with additional papers. So I will see whether we have any urgent 1 or 2 questions. We'll also ask Brennan to pull up the next poll, which will indicate that we are moving over to Russ's part. And let me see if I can perhaps ask Brennan if you could facilitate any questions that you feel we could answer, if there is any.
Yeah, absolutely. Really quickly, I'll just remind everyone, so not all the participants can see any questions posted in the chat. So please use the Q&A function, or the other option is you could raise your hand, and I'm actually able to allow someone to chat if you would like to ask your question out loud. That said, one of the questions that has shown up is, how do you balance documenting adaptations with all other things you plan to assess?
Thank you so much. I think that that's where I was hoping to remind you that in your own study, if the primary focus is not adaptations, you might have to do something very minimal to start to capture these ideas. So what we did, we had adaptations as one of our key implementation science purposes for these studies. So we really went to town and really try to figure out new ways of doing this. But there are some lower intensity ways, and we are thinking about doing this also in our colorectal cancer network projects, where some projects are not focused on implementation science per se or adaptations, but they will try to collect a couple of questions. And it is not put as a burden on the implementer, but instead the research team tries to ask these questions and document them. So the implementer is not burdened by this. I don't know, Russ, if you have any other thoughts.
I'd certainly concur with that. I think that'll work on an ongoing basis. The other thing is for future learning, I think it's often feasible to do kind of a post or an end of program like interview using one of these structured things, and that can inform future application without being too burdensome. And we found often, I think you can integrate that with other qualitative interviews or surveys that you might want to be doing. So the notion of taking advantage of things that are already ongoing to integrate your adaptation assessment. So maybe we should move on given the time. We want to be sure and allow plenty of time for discussion after I hopefully rapidly go through my slides, but we do have another poll here. And since I am going to be talking about our re-aim framework, this would really help if you could fill out this poll so I know how much time I need to spend on basics about re-aim. I don't want to put you to sleep or bore you if you know about it, but if you don't, I'll take a couple more minutes so you don't get totally lost in possible jargon. So if you'd please fill this out, and Brennan will let us know in a minute how we stand on re-aim familiarity.
I'll give folks about 20 more seconds to log a response. We're at 84%. All right, so it looks like we have 13 or 45% who've read about it in publications, 13 and 45% of those who answered that have used it in their research, and 10% that are not familiar with the re-aim framework.
Super, that's helpful and will allow me to go a little bit more quickly. Borsika is going to advance the slides for me. So most of what I have to share with you here comes from a recent publication that you can see there, where our note is that we're trying to make implementation science more rapid. Not at the speed of light, not warp speed, and probably not as rapid as QI type approaches, but much faster than we usually do science. This is, I won't spend the time to talk about them, but many of these are the same sites as part of a VA query project that Borsika and I are involved in, and I'll just show you the content areas of those in a moment. So next slide, Borsika. So this is the brief re-aim primer for those of you not familiar with it. The dimensions are down the left-hand column, where the acronym comes from. And on the right-hand side, we have, again, realizing real world work like yours doesn't have the luxury of taking, hours to do and spending lots of money to do the maybe definitive, perfect, as Borsika would say, implementation of re-aim. So we have what we call a pragmatic re-aim, and these are questions that we find are a lot easier for partners, implementation partners, to answer. And the only thing that I want to call your attention to now is in the implementation row. We're looking here to try and, again, assess this balance between the consistency, that's what we call the term rather than fidelity, consistency that your program or policy is implemented. Second, our focus for today, okay, how was it adapted? I might add when and things. And then finally, we really talk about cost to there, and usually that's time that's involved. And these are the key factors in implementation, as well as in all of these kind of understanding, usually qualitatively, how and why these results came about. Next slide. Okay, so I probably don't need to spend much time here. I think it's kind of blatantly apparent that why we need to be faster, because our stakeholders have already moved on and can't wait for us to complete a 5-year study there. So we're recently diving into the deep water here and trying to see how we can use re-aim, because to our knowledge, neither it nor most other models have been used rapidly to try and iteratively guide adaptations. Next slide. So this particular study that we had was to try and develop a pragmatic and replicable series of strategies that technically are an implementation strategy bundle that we do here to provide both a conceptual using REAIM and to some extent, to the extent possible, a data-based approach based on the emerging data that you're getting on different REAIM dimensions. And as I said, we were fortunate to be able to try and use and replicate this across 5 different projects, each of these, one on pain management, I think 2 were on care transitions, 1 on cardiac care procedures, and a rural health one. Next slide. Okay, so here are the steps. I'll spend just a moment on this to make sure you have a good concept to it, and then move rapidly through the actual results of it. So to begin with, we had a project meeting, and whenever possible, we try and work this into an already existing project meeting so we don't have to create another one that takes additional time or burden or scheduling. But it is important whenever possible, makes it a whole lot easier if you can define some goals on each of the REAIM dimensions. So for example, what is realistic in your project in terms of reach? What percentage of people do you think you can reach? Implementation, given the challenges with whether this is adherence or prep or whatever, what do you think is realistic in terms of implementation there? So that's the important first part. The second one then is periodically, and we did this at somewhat different times in each of the projects, but is to do ratings. And we feel it's important, one, to have diverse team members here. So you have a lot of stakeholders, includes researchers, but it's also like a key person as the project manager, but also like some community members, and then really importantly, people that deliver the front lines. So they do ratings, and I'll show you what those ratings are in a moment, on 2 things. One, at the current stage of your project, how important is like reach versus implementation versus adoption? And then secondly, what's your progress to date? Then, as a result of that, our group does take and compiles those results, and then at a follow-up meeting, usually, ideally, fairly soon, like a week or so later, we provide results, and I'll show you, particularly called a gap analysis, and then the group decides, reflects and discusses on these, and picks 1 or 2 REAIM dimensions. So again, you don't get overwhelmed, to try and focus on developing a plan for the next term until your next evaluation. And then finally, we do an evaluation to see how well it worked. Next slide. Okay, so here's the assessment form that we do ask each team member to fill out independently first, because we want to be sure we hear from everyone, and then we synthesize the results. 2 questions. Again, this one shows reach, but we do ask this for each of the REAIM dimensions, or sometimes we'll ask it of 4 dimensions, because the last or maintenance one, it may be premature to do that. But we ask you again, please rate the importance and then the progress to date that you've made on each dimension. And we ask you just to use your best guess. In some cases, like often reach, we have fairly good data, tracking data, so we'll know how many participants we've been able to enroll, how many have declined, and their comparability. Often we don't, though, and so we ask people just to use their best opinion. Next slide. Okay, so here's this gap analysis report that we talk about, that we provide, and simply we just roll up all the responses, and we show the mean response here, and then I'm not quite sure what to call them, but the lines within each bar show the variability or the range of ratings that have been done. For each of the REAIM dimensions, we have the green bar, which shows how important the team rated that dimension at that point in the project. And then the blue bar shows essentially how they rated the progress. And again, these are all, it says 6, but all on 5-point scales. So this again is just one example project, but this is what we provide to start or frame the discussion. Next slide. Okay, so what did we find? Well, we found that in general, we had about 7 team members across the 5 different projects participated in these meetings. The program or the team members did find in general that this process was feasible. Team members understood it, including those that didn't know about REAIM or weren't involved at the beginning. They found that the most dimensions defined as the most important, okay, again, not every case, but in general, were adoption, meaning that this is able to be done across a wide variety of different settings and different staff, and then effectiveness, not surprising there. The dimension that had the largest gap, again, this gap analysis, okay, was reach pretty consistently, okay? The ones that were selected, again, after this feedback by the teams that they chose to work on to try and improve, were fairly evenly distributed between reach and adoption. So next slide. Okay, so this shows you the various projects going down the left-hand side, what they were. The center column shows what they chose to focus on. This generally reflected this gap between importance and progress, but not always. It was up to the teams after they had a good discussion about that. And then example, I won't read these to you, but you can see based on this, then we had kind of a template and a guided process to set both a SMART goal, a real specific goal, and then an action plan for how to accomplish that, that then was reviewed at the next meeting when you did your next periodic assessment. Next slide. Okay, so let's just try a very quick example and then we'll open it up for questions. But thank you. I don't talk that fast, Borsica. I know I talk too fast. So what we did was we took a real example, interesting study here, trying to optimize and study the efficiency of cash transfers to antiretroviral therapy focused on adherence here in a nice cluster randomized trial. You can see the citation here that used the most optimization framework, and then for outcomes it used Nola Proctor and colleagues outcomes framework. So this is real. Now we're going to do a thought exercise. If you can go to the next slide. I'm making this up. I want to be clear. I should have put that underlined. This is hypothetical, but I think something that could well be done if you wanted to apply iterative REAIM to this program. So again, let's go over the steps that were involved. Early on, the team would meet together, involving all their critical stakeholders to define goals. Again, I just made these up, but realizing complex intervention, challenging population, they thought that a reasonable reach for reach would be 60%, and adherence level or effectiveness, again, the patient adherence was the key outcome, would be 75%, and staff implementation to the key parts, or you might see the key functions here, was 80%. This team pragmatically decided those were the 3 REAIM dimensions. It wasn't necessarily do all 5. Okay, and they assessed this. This was an ongoing project, approximately every 4 months. They decided that was a reasonable periodicity. Okay, based on this, then at each assessment, they, as we recommended, selected 1 to 2 REAIM targets to focus on based on a gap analysis, and then ideally, again, you would repeat this, for at least 3 cycles. And again, I might note that it doesn't have to be exactly every 4 months. In fact, you might want to do it more frequently early on and then a little less frequently after that. Next slide. Okay, so let's say what happened. From my own experience, not with your area, but from working with a variety of other projects, let's say that we find that our reach is not as high as we would like, challenging, and worse, we didn't get equitable participation. across whatever dimensions of equity are important to you, whether that's just demographic characteristics or social determinants, challenges, or whatever. But there was the effectiveness among those reached and participating was really pretty good as could be expected. And the staff did a good job implementing it there. So the potential decision then, after these data were presented and discussed, was to work on REACH doing several different things to try and change out. And that was, they changed out who approached them and how the opportunity to be involved in this was presented or frames. And then also the locations. They broadly expanded the locations to be where more people were rather than expecting them to come in. So then let's assume we did that, come back 4 months later. The second iterative assessment here found that in fact, REACH did improve, and maybe equally importantly, it was a little more equitable in terms of who participated. But unfortunately, now you have more people, potentially with more challenges. So the adherence, the effectiveness rate went down. So the potential group decision here might be, since the focus here, the main strategy was cash incentives, might be to increase the cash incentives. Next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to come back. That was, again, our attempt to try and make it concretely relevant to how you might use it in one of your projects. But I'm going to summarize kind of what we know to date, focusing primarily on the work Borsuk and I have done in these VA studies. So just so we don't oversell or overpromise this, to date, it's been a small number of teams, okay? And the ones we've personally worked on have been VA projects. There are a few others we know about. Second bullet point, some members had used RE-AIM before and set some goals at baseline. This was especially the research team members. But again, we did find that other members, generally implementation staff, even though they hadn't been involved in an initial decision, were able to kind of figure out what was going on and understand it. But at least some people did. And again, as a result of this, we strongly recommend that they set some RE-AIM goals beginning. In this setting, the teams decided correctly or incorrectly, I don't know, that it didn't involve patients itself, or the high-level organization decision makers. It did involve a number of people, again, average of 7 from different roles, but it didn't involve what may be real important constituents here. And then finally, I think we're going to finish up in time for discussion. We didn't have a way to experimentally contrast this. So it wasn't a randomized experiment where we had some projects did this and others didn't. Okay, so we have to kind of just rely on the data that was coming along, the feedback we have, and then the overall final results, which generally look positive, but we can't attribute that just to this project. So future directions, I think you can see, generally that's just focus on replication, which I always stress across different settings. And then I also think at the bottom there, comparing, if we can, different timings, different intensities, different amounts of help from the research team, and to look at the cost effectiveness of this. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to wrap up and then just leave you with a few teasers and shameless self-promotions that Borsuk and I have here. So, although we clearly, this is a work in progress, we feel that it was helpful, again, at least across 5 pretty diverse projects, 5 different teams, 5 different content areas. It does look feasible for us. It seemed to make sense to the practitioners and the implementing staff there. And then more than anything else, whether you use iterative RE-AIM or IM Adapt or some of the other approaches that are MADI, the other approaches that are evolving, we really feel that, again, as Borsuk said, adaptations are going to happen. So why not work with the people involved, the teams, to help guide these so that the adaptations that happen are, if possible, a little more based, as Borsuk mentioned, along the core components or the functions that you want to do, and are more likely to succeed rather than just having these adaptations willy-nilly. And most important of all, that I should have put here, is, as Borsika did a nice job, that you document these, not only for the team and replicating that, but for the evolving science of this, to document what types of adaptation happen, when, by who, for what purpose. Next slide. I think these are hopefully kind of self-apparent by now. First one was the bullet point. I guess I didn't need to add it, that adaptations are going to happen. Brian Mittman, the middle point, I love this because I've lived this history that Borsika talked about, where any adaptation or deviation from a 150-page protocol was considered bad science. So Brian kind of led the way, doing a lot of work with the PCORI methodology standards to let's get serious or real about this and understanding adaptations. Next slide. Okay, here is Borsika, you may need to help me. This was a surprise slide here. Do you want to tell me about this one? And then maybe you can finish up with the last slides too.
Absolutely. No, I apologize, Russ. This was just a reminder that there is other work happening, and this is one of the work that is really prominent in this area. Russ actually participated in the work group that and contributed some to the development of these new guidelines around adaptations. The first version is available. So just go to this website and explore methodology. This has been led by UK folks, and we have been interacting with them and really enjoying learning about the approach of thinking of adaptations. And then moving on, we have a work group where we talk about only adaptations and fidelity and tailoring, and everyone is welcome. It started with the VA and it's within the VA and sponsored by them, but we have members from all around. So join us if you can. Please email me or Russ and we'll add you. And then we also have a certificate program that has specific context and adaptation course as well as other DNI related courses. We just wanted to share this with you in case you want more in-depth DNI training. And then with that, we finished all of our slides. We have a few minutes left. So Brandon, I will hand it over to you to ask some questions. I might keep for now sharing the screen, but I will step out of my presentation mode so I can see you guys better.
All right, thank you so much, both of you, Borsika and Russ. It was really nice to see all these examples, even synthetic and, in HIV, and then also the work that's been happening at the VA. We do actually have a series of questions, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So the first one is about documenting fidelity and how that relates to documenting adaptation. So if you're documenting fidelity through a multi-methods approach to assess it, have you incorporated adaptation assessment into the same fidelity assessments? It seems natural, but could get messy too.
Great question. I'm happy to try a quick answer here. We have talked a lot about how, fidelity and adaptation are truly kind of complementary in some ways. And so most fidelity checklists and fidelity approaches have been very focused on documenting what was not done. And I think that gives us a sense of adaptations, but not qualifying why those happen. So I think that it would be natural to expand your fidelity assessments with gathering more information about why certain items don't check out. So if something was not done of the core components, providing at least a box where you could document why those changes were made, that could, I think, start to give you a sense of adaptations. I don't know, Russ, if you have other thoughts.
Just quickly, and then Brendan, I want to check with you. It's true that all participants can see the Q&A, is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so what I'm going to try and do is give a brief supplement to that and then take a quick shot at answering the next two so we can move along here given the short amount of time that's left. I totally agree with what Borsika said. The other thing I might add to that I want to be clear we haven't done, but we're going to do, I think, in our new and ongoing projects, is to focus this around a process map, which is where you work with the teams to see the flow about who's going to do what. And then I think with assessing that is very natural to assess both how did that go? Did it work out the process map? And then where it didn't, what types of adaptations were made? Why were those adaptations made? Second question has to do with, would you say reach and effectiveness are all about adapting the intervention, whereas adoption and maintenance are about implementation strategies? Again, to answer this, remember back to the nice matrix that Borsika and I are pushing. That's what we're selling this about, thinking about what is adapted when. And I'll maybe just editorialize a little bit, but first, the answer to that is no. I would say that any of these can be adapted. Borsika might want to jump in here, or the questioner, feel free to push back a little bit if you see it differently. But I think this can be done a lot. And I would say this notion about intervention versus implementation often, from my perspective, varies more according to timing. Often I think that I see the intervention being done more early on at the planning or preparation phase, and then the implementation strategies being the focus during implementation, but that kind of cuts across the re-aim dimension. Last thing I'll mention, just editorializing, is the last one, the context, isn't talked about much, but I think is maybe an area for the future. Because it may just be, being realistic, that some settings, it just won't work even. And better to know that initially, if given this program and the implementation strategy is just not feasible, to know that early on. Or it may need to be that certain things, like often staffing, need to change. And ideally you find that out before, but if not, during implementation. Next one, or quickly, Borsika, you want to add anything to that, or feel free to disagree if you'd like to.
No, let's move on, Russ. That's good.
Okay, next one, iteratively modifying strategies. Wouldn't this impact your ability to draw conclusions about the effectiveness of the intervention? Potentially, and to some extent, yes. And that is the reason why, or one of the reasons why I think adaptations, have received a bad name. I think our response to that would be, it's going to happen anyway, as Brian Mitman says, so you can pretend that it doesn't happen and let it happen willy-nilly and not know what it does, or you can be somewhat more realistic. My other response would be going back. Monica is on here, I know, and may want to weigh in, and we don't get any kickback from her for saying this. But I think going back to this form versus function is really helpful. To me, it's not just the exact protocol that, again, I'll exaggerate only slightly. Some studies have a 250-page manual. It's not just that page 84 of that was done exactly at the time it was supposed to be, but it was the key functions, or other people, the core components. I think that's what we're trying to understand, not this exact thing, but we want to understand, is this principle or this function or the core components delivered? And I think actually adaptation can help inform that. So Borsika, why don't you take the next, either comment on that or maybe take the next one.
I don't see them, Russ, but I will come in now because I was sharing. I apologize. The next one was, this looks very pragmatic, but it feels that it makes pragmatic. One has to capitalize on subjectivity. Is there anything that can make it more objective, fact-based? I think that one of the things that Russ highlighted there, great point again, is that we have not been able to collect systematic data about the impact of adaptations. So starting to measure it, quantify and qualitatively, what is the impact when we change things in the program, and how that impacts either implementation or effectiveness for that matter, will help to make this method more objective or fact-based, I think. And in some cases, as Russ mentioned, reach, often measured throughout the study, easy, relatively easy to follow that. With other things, we have to be more creative. So kind of a process data can help you identify what changes longitudinally happen with different types of outcomes. And you might identify outcomes that are relatively easy to align with the adaptation.
And with that, I think we're at the top of the hour. Brennan, I don't know about your group or what you do. I at least could stay on another 5 minutes if people wanted to, but you may have a hard stop, but we'll turn it back to you.
I'd be happy to stay for another 5 minutes if you're willing to answer the rest of the questions.
Okay, let's do that. The only thing I would say is that in response to this great questions about the subjectivity, we're trying to creatively think about how to make it more data-based. Like one example, but this is easier, to the extent to which the intervention is either more automated, we have one, or like their data where it fits, like you have something like an electronic health record that can provide real-time data. But I think that more depends on what the project is, how it's set up, your intervention. But I will make a case kind of for the subjective ratings and hearing from different people's perspectives. I think that's really equally important to the data. And we found that notion, hearing from others, and sometimes it was more useful rather than relying on just the absolute data that we presented on the importance versus the progress, to let different people talk about their perceptions and why, and then collectively to come to a group decision there.
The next one, Russ, is asking about, Shiri is asking about a very good pragmatic question. You know, what happens when you make these changes and you have to follow that with IRB approvals and modifications? And so, especially in the context of low resource settings, LMICs, where it takes a long time to make any change. And then she answers somewhat her own question, actually, that perhaps it's built into the initial application, that there will be some modifications to the program. I don't know that I have a better answer to you, Shiri, actually, for the IRB perspective than preparing for it and as much as possible building it into the initial submission. But I do agree that this could be a pragmatic challenge, as you are, especially in settings when a simple modification can take longer. I don't know, Russ, do you have the magic bullet?
No, but let me just hypothetically give an example with the cash incentives. One way to do that we've tried to do is to do our IRBs with a moderate level of specificity, but to leave us a little wiggle room. So for example, if they started with $10 cash incentives and go up to 25, our proposal might say that in fact this could vary, but it would be a range. You know, it will be at least $10 and no more than say $30 or whatever. At least each IRB is different, of course, but see that there. The other thing is we're moving to rapidly to another question. I'd like, if people want to raise their hand, if Brennan wants to let them in. I know there's at least 2 or 3 people that have a lot of expertise in this area and things like Monica we referred to, or JD was on earlier. If some of the other, Dennis is on, I see. If others want you jump in here, please just raise your hand and jump in. Again, this is a work in progress. We're very excited about it, but it's not definitive. And again, you all know your projects a lot better than we do. So you might want to answer some of these questions, or can probably give concrete examples better than we can. Anything, Brennan? Okay, well, I think I at least do need to run to the next meeting now, but I just want to really thank you all. You were a great audience. We'll be glad to follow up, provide these things, and appreciate the great questions and comments. And hopefully you can see a few more things coming out from us within the next year.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, everyone. Brennan, Jasmine, Dennis, for setting this up for us and navigating us through the content and format. And I think this is going to be shared. There is a question about recordings. So I let you, Brennan, address that. And thanks, everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, everyone who's still on, for hanging in there with us for an extra couple minutes. Thank you so much again, Borsika and Russ, for presenting. It was super rich. I really thought we had a great discussion here afterwards as well. I will post it takes us about a week or so to get the edits done, but we post both the webinar as well as the slides to the ISKI community of practice. And it also will send it out in our newsletter that goes out every week. So for folks that weren't able to attend, those recordings will be available here in about a week.